There are moments in history when the world holds its breath, not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. This is one of those moments. What you are about to hear is not a dramatization, not an exaggeration, and not a political talking point designed to push you toward one side or another. This is the raw, unfiltered account of a conflict that has shaken the foundations of an entire region, rattled the corridors of power in the world's most influential capitals, and left ordinary human beings, mothers, fathers, children, soldiers, civilians, caught in the merciless machinery of geopolitical warfare. If you think you already understand what is happening between Iran and Israel, I promise you, you do not. Not yet. Because what the headlines skim across the surface of, what the news tickers reduce to a line of scrolling text, is in reality a seismic rupture in the architecture of modern warfare, and it begins with a decision. A cold, deliberate, calculated decision made inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, a decision that the world is still paying for in blood. To understand what happened, you have to first understand the environment in which it happened. For decades, the relationship between Iran and Israel has existed in a state of controlled hostility, a war fought not with open armies clashing on battlefields, but through proxies, through shadows, through carefully orchestrated strikes designed to inflict pain while preserving deniability. Iran funds Hezbollah in Lebanon, arms Hamas in Gaza, equips the Houthis in Yemen, and channels weapons and money to militias embedded across Iraq and Syria. Israel, in turn, conducts hundreds of strikes per year against Iranian assets in the region, targeting weapons shipments, military commanders, strategic infrastructure, all while maintaining what military analysts call the campaign between the wars. Both sides understood the rules. Both sides knew the lines, and for a long time, both sides chose not to cross them. Then something changed. What changed was not a single event, but an accumulation, a slow, grinding compression of pressure that eventually became impossible to contain. The October 7th attack by Hamas had already redrawn every map in the Middle East, triggering a war in Gaza that Iran's proxies were deeply embedded in. But Iran's calculation had always been the same: let the proxies bleed Israel, preserve the homeland, keep the nuclear program intact, and wait. Iran believed it was untouchable on its own soil. Iran was wrong. When Israeli strikes began reaching inside Iran, not at proxies, not at regional assets, but at Iranian territory itself, at military installations, at air defense systems, something in Tehran snapped. The old doctrine of plausible deniability suddenly felt insufficient. The Revolutionary Guard commanders, who had spent years speaking in the language of patience and strategic patience, were now facing a different kind of pressure, the pressure of humiliation. And humiliated powers do dangerous things. The decision to launch a direct, large-scale assault against Israeli territory was not made in a vacuum. It was made by men who understood exactly what they were doing, men who had war-gamed this scenario, men who had calculated the thresholds and decided the moment had arrived to blow past them. What followed was an operation unlike anything the Middle East had seen in a generation. Hundreds of drones launched simultaneously, ballistic missiles fired in salvos designed to overwhelm air defense systems through sheer volume. Cruise missiles threading through radar coverage gaps. The sky over Israel and over the region became a battlefield. It was not a surprise attack designed for maximum casualties. It was a demonstration of capability, a message sent in the language of missiles. And the message was unmistakable. We can reach you. We have always been able to reach you. And now we are no longer afraid to prove it. But here is where the story becomes something more than a military briefing. Here is where it becomes human. Because inside that barrage of missiles and drones, inside that calculated display of force, were real consequences. Real people on the ground, real families crouching in bomb shelters, listening to the thunder rolling across the sky above them. Real soldiers scrambling to intercept projectiles traveling at speeds and altitudes that test the absolute limits of human-engineered defense systems. Real first responders rushing toward impact sites before the smoke had even cleared. The Iron Dome intercepted most of what was coming. American and British and Jordanian forces contributed to the defense, and yet, not everything was stopped. Not everything could be stopped, because that is the terrifying mathematical reality of modern missile warfare. When you fire enough projectiles, some will find their mark. And when they do, the cost is paid not in political points, but in lives. The casualties that resulted were not statistics. They were people with names, with families, with histories that no headline will ever fully capture. A young soldier stationed at an airbase, someone's son, someone's brother, caught in an explosion that reduced everything around him to rubble and silence. Civilians and communities near strategic targets who had done nothing except exist in a geography that had become contested. Emergency medical teams triaging wounds that bore the unmistakable signature of shrapnel and blast pressure. Hospitals receiving patients in the hours after the strike whose injuries told the story of what it means to be in the path of ballistic ordnance. These are the human receipts of geopolitical decisions made by men sitting in protected bunkers far from the fire they ignite. Israel's response to the attack was not immediate in the theatrical sense. There was no same-night retaliation, no reflex counterstrike that might spiral both nations into a full-scale war that nobody, in truth, wanted or was fully prepared for. Instead, there was something arguably more unnerving than fury: calculation. Israel began the slow, methodical process of determining what a proportionate but decisive response would look like. Not one that would satisfy the emotional demand for vengeance, but one that would achieve strategic objectives while signaling to Iran and to the world that the old rules had permanently changed. Behind closed doors in secure conference rooms, intelligence officials and military chiefs were mapping targets, not proxies, not warehouses in Syria, Iran, the real Iran, the Iran that had just declared through its missiles that the era of controlled escalation was over. The international community watched with the particular helplessness that defines modern diplomacy. The United States, Israel's closest ally, was simultaneously supplying intelligence and calling for restraint. The United Kingdom had participated in the air defense effort. Jordan, in a development that stunned many observers, had scrambled its own jets to intercept Iranian projectiles passing through its airspace, a move that revealed just how deeply the regional calculus had shifted, how even Arab states with their own complicated relationships with Iran were now making choices in real time about which side of this equation they would stand on. China and Russia offered carefully worded statements that said everything and nothing. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session and produced, as it so often does in genuine crises, very little of practical consequence. But here is what matters most, what cuts through all the diplomatic noise and geopolitical maneuvering and strategic posturing, is the question of what this moment actually means. Not just for Israel and Iran, not just for the Middle East, but for the world. Because what happened when Iran chose to fire those missiles was not simply a military event. It was a threshold event. It was the moment that a regional conflict that had been carefully managed, carefully contained, carefully kept inside certain boundaries, was no longer contained. The walls between proxy war and direct war came down. And once walls like those come down, history tells us, they are extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The rules of engagement that governed the previous decade no longer apply with the same force. Both sides now know they will strike the other's territory. Both sides now know the other is willing. And that bilateral knowledge, that mutual understanding of each other's willingness to cross lines previously considered uncrossable, does not make the situation more stable. It makes it more dangerous, far more dangerous. Because the next provocation, whatever form it takes, will not be evaluated against the old framework, it will be evaluated against this one. The people of Israel went to sleep on the night of that attack not knowing if they would wake to another barrage. The soldiers manning air defense batteries stayed at their posts through the long hours of darkness, watching radar screens for signatures that might mean another wave was coming. The people of Iran, ordinary Iranians who have no more control over their government's military decisions than ordinary Israelis do, were caught in their own particular anxiety, the knowledge that their country had just lit a fuse, and the understanding, shared by everyone in the region, that what happens next will not be gentle. Part 2. There is a version of this story that gets told in the language of states and governments and military doctrines. In that version, what happened is a strategic miscalculation by Iran, an overextension of deterrence theory, a failure to accurately model Israeli and American responses. That version is accurate, but it is incomplete, because alongside that version runs another story, the one that unfolds in the bodies and minds of the people who live inside these events, who do not have the luxury of processing them as strategic variables. This story is about what it actually feels like to be on the ground when the world above you turns lethal. Picture the air raid sirens. If you have never heard an Israeli air raid siren, you cannot fully understand what it does to the human body. It is not merely a sound. It is a physiological event, a spike of cortisol and adrenaline so immediate and so total that rational thought briefly ceases, and something older, something wired into the deepest architecture of the human nervous system takes over completely. Run, hide, protect. The people of Israel have lived with this sound as a periodic feature of their existence for years. But this night was different, because the sirens did not stop. They layered over each other across cities and towns and military zones, creating a wall of sound that communicated not a single threat but a coordinated, multi-front, massive-scale assault. Parents grabbed children. Elderly residents who could not move quickly were helped by neighbors. Soldiers ran to their stations, and across the sky the lights began. The interception of incoming missiles and drones looks from a distance like something almost beautiful. Bright streaks ascending from the earth, meeting other streaks descending from above, detonating in flashes of orange and white against the darkness. But up close in the communities beneath those detonations, it is not beautiful. It is debris falling. It is pressure waves. It is the concussive boom of a kill shot that rattles windows and shakes bones and reminds everyone below that the war being fought above their heads is not theoretical. It is immediate. It is inches away. And when interception fails, when a missile or a drone or a piece of shrapnel evades every defense and finds the ground, the sound changes entirely. It becomes something that people who have heard it describe as incomprehensible, not the sound of war as imagined from a distance, the sound of war as it actually is. The casualties from Iran's attack on Israel were not, by the brutal arithmetic of major conflicts, enormous in number. But that framing, the comparison to larger, bloodier events, is one of the most morally dangerous frames we can apply to human death, because every single person who died in those strikes was not a number. They were the center of someone's universe. The soldier who was killed at the base had a family that will carry the shape of his absence for the rest of their lives. The civilians injured, some severely, some in ways that will mark them permanently, did not experience their injuries as a data point in a strategic assessment. They experienced them as the sudden violent transformation of their ordinary human existence. And the psychological casualties, the children who will have nightmares, the adults who will flinch at sounds, the communities whose sense of safety has been irreparably altered, do not appear in any official count, but they are real, and they are vast. Iran, in launching this attack, achieved several things simultaneously, and understanding all of them is essential to understanding where this is going. It demonstrated that it possesses the capability to project force directly against Israeli territory, bypassing the proxy network and delivering a message in its own name. It tested Israeli and allied air defenses in real combat conditions, generating intelligence about response times, interception rates, and defensive gaps that Iranian military planners will study intensely. It sent a signal to its own domestic audience, a population living under immense economic pressure, under sanctions, under the weight of international isolation, that the Islamic Republic is not weak, that it will not absorb Israeli strikes without response, that it retains the power and the will to act. And it fundamentally altered the regional security architecture in ways that will take years to fully understand. But Iran also achieved something it did not intend to achieve. It achieved unity, not universal unity, not the kind of unity that erases genuine political disagreements. Israel's internal politics remain fractured and contested even in crisis. But the particular, focused, operational unity that emerges when a country faces an external threat of this scale. The debates about judicial reform, about the conduct of the war in Gaza, about the political future of various leaders, all of that receded temporarily behind the shared experience of being on the receiving end of a nation-state's direct military assault. And that unity, fragile and temporary as it may be, is politically and militarily significant, because an Israel that feels itself under direct attack from Iran is an Israel that will sustain a level of military engagement that might otherwise be difficult to justify domestically. The Israeli response, when it came, was calibrated in the way that only a military with genuine strategic depth and intelligence capability can calibrate a response. It was not designed for spectacle. It was not designed to trigger a war that neither side has the appetite to fight to its conclusion. It was designed to demonstrate precisely, surgically, undeniably, that Iran's air defenses are not impenetrable, that Iranian military infrastructure, the kind that is supposed to protect the nuclear program, is reachable, that the strategic equation Iran had been operating under, the assumption that its homeland was beyond the reach of serious military consequences, was an illusion. The message delivered by Israel's response was the mirror image of the one Iran had sent. We can reach you too. We have always been able to reach you. and now both of us know it in a way that neither side can pretend away. The world watching this exchange was, in a very real sense, watching the future being written in real time. Because what is being established in this back and forth between Iran and Israel is not just a series of military events. It is a new doctrine, a new understanding of what direct state-to-state conflict looks like in the modern era, conducted not with the massed armies of the 20th century, but with missiles and drones and cyber operations and intelligence warfare fought across distances that previous generations would have considered incomprehensible, with weapons that can travel from one country to another in minutes. The technology of this conflict has outpaced the diplomacy designed to contain it, and that gap between what modern weapons can do and what modern diplomacy can prevent is the most frightening space in contemporary geopolitics. There are people in this story whose names will never be spoken on a major broadcast. People in the communities of southern Iran who live near the military installations that Israel struck in its response. Ordinary citizens who had no voice in their government's decision to launch missiles at another country, who did not choose to live adjacent to targets, who woke up one morning inside a conflict zone. People in the northern Israeli communities along the Lebanese border who have been living under Hezbollah rocket fire for months and who now face the additional knowledge that Iranian ballistic missiles are also a variable in their daily risk calculation. People working in hospitals in both countries, doctors and nurses and paramedics who see the physical consequences of geopolitical decisions and who will carry those images long after the politicians who made the decisions have moved on to the next crisis. The humanitarian dimension of this conflict, frequently the last thing discussed in strategic analyses and the first thing felt by actual human beings, demands more than a footnote: the displacement of populations near conflict zones. The psychological trauma accumulating across entire generations, the infrastructure damage that does not appear in military assessments but that shapes the daily lives of people who are simply trying to exist, the economic consequences of sustained conflict that fall hardest on those with the least ability to absorb them. These are not soft considerations irrelevant to the hard calculus of national security. They are, in fact, the very substance of what national security is supposed to protect. What happens next in this conflict is a question that no one, not the intelligence agencies, not the military planners, not the geopolitical analysts who have spent careers studying this region, can answer with certainty. The variables are too many, the actors too numerous, the interests too divergent. Iran has its own internal dynamics, its own power struggles, its own calculation of what level of escalation serves the regime's survival. Israel has an election cycle and a coalition government and a military that operates with extraordinary professionalism, but within a political context that is always volatile. The United States has its own imperatives, strategic, domestic, electoral, that shape how aggressively it will constrain or enable Israeli action. And the regional states, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the UAE, Egypt, are all making their own calculations, their own quiet communications, their own private preparations for scenarios that they hope will not come to pass. What we can say with certainty is this: the world that existed before Iran chose to fire those missiles does not exist anymore. The threshold that was crossed cannot be uncrossed. The demonstration of direct state-to-state military strikes between Iran and Israel, something that the region had managed to avoid for decades of hostility, is now part of the established record of what these two nations are willing to do to each other. And that record shapes every future decision, every future calculation, every future moment of crisis when someone on either side has to decide how far to go. The question is no longer whether Iran and Israel will strike each other. They already have. The question is whether the framework that emerges from this moment will be one of managed deterrence. Two countries that have proven they can hurt each other and who therefore choose rationally not to, or one of escalatory spiral, where each strike demands a larger response, where each response generates a new provocation, where the logic of mutual destruction slowly consumes every other consideration. History offers examples of both outcomes. It offers examples of adversaries who, having demonstrated their capability to destroy each other, pulled back from the edge and found a cold, uncomfortable, sustainable equilibrium. And it offers examples of adversaries who did not, who allowed the momentum of conflict to carry them past every rational stopping point, into wars that consumed them both. Which path Iran and Israel take will depend on decisions not yet made, by people under pressures not yet fully formed, in circumstances not yet fully visible. That is the terrifying and honest truth of where we stand. But here is what must not be lost in the strategic analysis. Here is what must be held on to stubbornly and insistently in the face of every dry briefing and every detached assessment of military options. The people caught in this conflict are not abstractions. The Israeli families who sheltered from the barrage are not strategic variables. The Iranian people who did not choose their government's decisions are not acceptable collateral. The soldiers who died were not simply casualties in an acceptable exchange ratio. They were human beings, living the only lives they had, in a world that powerful men decided to make more dangerous. And every time we let that reality recede, every time we allow the clinical language of deterrence theory and escalation management to replace the human language of grief and fear and loss, we make it a little easier for the next decision to be made without the weight it deserves. This conflict is not over. The missiles have not stopped flying in the minds of everyone who was under that sky. And until the humans at the center of this crisis are treated as the point, not as the cost, the cycle will not break.